Welcome to Straight Talk. The meat industry seems serious about getting its act together with news of a new initiative involving silver fern farms, PGG Wrightson and Landcorp. Is it really what sheep and beef farmers have been pleading for? Cooperative action by sector players to bring it back from the brink. Over at the Beehive, Agriculture Minister David Carter is still struggling to find a new chairman for the Wool Industry Task Force. Is this an indication of the turmoil of the industry? And are dairy farmers really earning 3 times the income of their sheep and beef colleagues? What's the latest from that MAF monitoring report? Today I'm joined by economic commentator Rod Oram and Conor English, Chief Executive of Federated Farmers. Welcome. Now, Rod, what do you make of this new meat initiative? It's a very hopeful sign?
There are some steps in the right direction, but there is a very substantial overclaim on the part of all the parties involved. So they say that investing $151 million of company and government money over 7 years will transform the sector from production-led to market-led and deliver great benefits. So, for example, out by 2025, the return to lamb farmers would be 50% higher than now and would generate an extra $8 billion of GDP. Now, I think those numbers are quite extraordinary and very implausible because there is a huge fatal flaw in the plan, which is that it doesn't involve the ultimate seller, which is the supermarket. And I just can't believe that the supermarkets of the world are going to see all this extra value being created in the value chain and not claim a large part of it. One last point is that if you look at the analysis by NZIER, more than half the benefit in the first 2 years comes from on-farm productivity gains, and over the 7 years it's still 56%. So in other words, whilst it's a very bold claim about a switch from production-led to market-led, it's actually about achieving some more efficiency upstream on farm and then in processing rather than trying to capture that value downstream. And as I say, that's where it's going to be going. A lot of that value is going to be going to the supermarkets, not to the farmers. Because
I know there's been talk of a change to plate back to paddock scenario. You're saying some of the problems will come right at that plate end.
Absolutely. And actually the industry needs to be thinking about how it would build a completely different value chain, which to some extent would take some of their sales away from the supermarkets and therefore capture much more of that value coming right back to farmers.
Yeah, well, Conor, that sounds a pretty radical shake-up that Rod's talking about. What do you think sheep and beef farmers will make of it?
Well, look, sheep and beef farmers are struggling at the moment, and there does, something does need to happen. We've got a target of $150 a lamb for mid-season lamb, and anything that will put us towards that has to be good. And $150 million of effort over 6 or 7 years, which is about $25 million a year, has to be a good thing rather than nothing. I think though that Rod makes a good point. Part of the problem for the farmer in his return is that he's just not getting enough of the consumer dollar. And the margins that the supermarkets are taking and other people in the supply chain are taking are actually quite high. So I've had recent discussions with farmers from the UK, for example, and the States, and they simply say, why don't our suppliers of meat from New Zealand simply charge more? One of the other things, though, that we often get is, why aren't we doing a Fonterra in the meat industry? Well, actually, what does that mean? And what it means is that farmers have to have a long-term contract with one supplier. And I think part of this initiative is trying to do a bit of that rather than have a spot market every Sunday night. Now, farmers are prepared to do that and meat companies are prepared to do that. That will make a difference. Now, they can do that right now if they want to, but they're choosing not to do that.
Yeah, but Rod, farmers have been notoriously shy of contracts in the past, or if they've signed up to them, they've broken them when it suited them. What do you see the answer?
That culture is going to remain a very big pressure on this new partnership. And it's up to the new partnership to demonstrate to farmers who enter into it with them that they can deliver those long-term benefits. Now, it's a big help having Landcorp in there. And I think Landcorp's planning to commit about 1/3 of its stock ultimately to the venture. So that will give the venture a good supply of meat from a responsible long-term farmer. So hopefully that will start to change the culture. But Conor's right, and until the whole sector gets off that Sunday night spot market, the sector will never be able to invest enough in its own future.
What else needs to happen, Conor? I mean, there's quite a big mind shift you're talking about, but there's a lot of practicalities there as well that need to alter, don't they?
Yeah.
Further restructuring within the meat industry in terms
well,
of
there's certainly a
plant
view
reconfiguration and
there's an overcapacity issue. I mean, we've gone from 28 million lambs down to 21. The Green Party will be pleased about that, you know, but the workers aren't, and they're losing their jobs in the region. So, yep, there does have to be some rationalisation. Or alternatively, there has to be growth in stock numbers, and that's only going to happen if farmers get paid more, because they're quietly going broke at the moment. But one of the other differences, Glenys, though, between the meat industry and the dairy industry is that Fonterra is essentially an international logistics company. They move protein from different continents to where their customers want it. Our supply chain from meat tends to be very Eurocentric. It's one-dimensional. It's not multi-dimensional. We're very focused on that European market. You know, the Asian nations now are wanting a lot more protein. You know, what are we doing up there? And I hope that this money and this partnership will see us looking a lot more in the Asian direction, because there's very definitely a growing demand there and a growing ability to pay the prices that we need. Right.
Well, looking at sheep and beef farmers' incomes, obviously a big proportion of that in the past used to be the wool check. Not so much now. What can be done about that side of things? Rod, the Wool Industry Task Force started off with the best of intentions, but David Carter's having a bit of trouble finding a replacement for Murray Horn to take over the reins.
Yeah, I'm not the least bit surprised because I still feel that the sector is not, again, addressing the fundamental issue, which is, again, thinking about the entire value chain. So by far the best example of what that new value chain would look like would be what Icebreaker's done with Merino, and buying something like a third of the Merino clip on long-term contract. And indeed, Federated Farmers President Don Albury is very... Nicholson. Don Albury.
He's the High Country.
He's the High Country. Don is one of those farmers, and I've heard Don talk very well about how that's allowed him to invest differently in his farm. So the industry needs to think in those terms. It's not just simply, oh, let's think of a cute brand we can put on strong wool to try and make a difference. So until there are some people who are prepared to come forward to think in those terms, then the wool sector is going absolutely nowhere.
There does seem to be a feeling out there amongst some farmers, Conor, that they've given up on wool.
Yeah, it's a waste product. Essentially for them now. It's something you have to deal with. It's almost like dagging. You have to get it off the sheep, because if you leave it on there, it becomes a hassle. And that's a crying shame, because...
But it's the most wonderful natural product in the world.
Absolutely. Look, we actually had a lot in common with Jeanette Fitzsimmons on this, and we got approval from the government to have wool as an insulation part of their insulation program. Wasn't originally in there, and so we got it included. But wool is, you're dead right, is a fantastic product. There's a lot of people out there who are cold. A lot of people who get wet, and a lot of carpets out there, but we just don't seem to be cracking it. And what's amazing is that, you know, in 1950 we were over half New Zealand's exports were wool. Now we export more gold to Australia than we sell wool to the rest of the planet.
That's a very sobering statistic, isn't it, Rod?
It is, but you have to fundamentally bear in mind how the whole market has shifted for fabrics, for example, and indeed for floor coverings. And so there is nowhere near the scope for traditional uses of wool that there was. So it's actually about trying to think of some very different uses of wool, and eco-insulation that uses wool is certainly a good example. But again, until the wool sector starts to think in those terms, it's going to make no progress at all.
You've got a whole bunch of middlemen in the wool supply chain as well, and look, they're just like stockbrokers. They don't really care what the share price is or what the share sells for. They just clip their ticket. Someone tried to tell me there was about 30 people in that supply chain. So there's a heck of a lot of people clipping the ticket on the way through, and the farmer just gets left with whatever's left over, and it's not much.
Well, that's the beauty of the cooperative system, Fonterra would tell us. But in the dairy side of things, Rod, there's some fairly, not negative exactly, but certainly payout expectations have been dampened a little for farmers.
Yes, which isn't a surprise given the way the global economy is tracking. Obviously, lots of talk about a double-dip recession in many countries. I still believe that's unlikely in most countries, but consumer demand is backing off. And at the same time, the currency will help farmers a little bit. I would imagine, I'm always very reluctant to forecast currencies, but if you look at the basic dynamics of what's going on in the world, you could understand how the New Zealand dollar is more likely to be weaker than stronger going forward.
Yeah, well, that'd be great news for all farmers, wouldn't it, Conor?
Well, yeah, the dollar does have an impact, absolutely. I mean, if it drops 10%, you get about a 15% increase in your return, and that'd be very welcome. But as Rod says, who knows where the dollar's going to be, because you've got two relativities, and the reason our dollar's been so strong is because the other dollars have been so bad.
Yeah, but this is where obviously it's a hard sell to farmers, but you need to bear in mind that a strong currency is a reward for a strong economy.
And that's what we all want.
And so there are benefits for strong currency. Just imagine how cheap those tractors become when you want to import them. Again, you know, it's a huge challenge to the primary sector, but how would you imagine, what would the primary sector need to do to make a very good return at, say, parity to the US dollar?
That's right.
And so we always need to remind ourselves that a weak currency is just letting us off the hook, and it's not a long-term solution.
And I think also, Glenys, on that, when we have had weak currencies in the past, what's happened is, say in the meat industry, for example, all that's happened is the processors have discounted their meat into the market, and given the benefit to the supermarkets.
And that's not a good long-term situation. No. Thanks, gentlemen. Yeah. Coming up after the break, NIWA's temperature records go under the gun, and the battle to win the hearts and minds by the Chinese buyers of our dairy farms heats up and goes public. Stay with us. Welcome back to Straight Talk. Now it's on to You Said It, comment in the ag media, which we want to talk about further. Well, Conor, the Manawatu River, what's happening there? Federated farmers not signing, delaying signing?
Yeah, look, there's just a process issue there that the local executive hadn't had a meeting, and if they're putting their name to something, they want to make sure that they've got everyone on board. I think it was a big issue was made out of nothing really. But I think around the signing. But I think the issue of water quality is a big issue. I think it is something that the farming community does have to address, and we do have to look for objective, scientifically, economically, practical-based solutions for it. What we're getting in the issue is just a bit too much emotion.
Well, there are an awful lot of people who have a stake in this, aren't there? And they all want to have their say. They all have their own feelings about things.
Yeah, they do. And it's not helped, though, when we're getting a wee bit of subjective science. We need objective science in this debate. And what people think, what I think people need to understand is that the farming community is looking to address it. It is trying to do stuff. It is investing a lot of money in it. We are getting results. We are making progress. So I think that needs to be acknowledged by the green groups, that we are making progress on it. And also it needs to be acknowledged that part of the problem is from our urban communities as well. The Manawatu River, you know, they put an enormous amount of waste from the city into that river, and no one talks about that. They just try and have a go at the old dairy farmer because he's an easy target. And I think the farmers are a wee bit tired of that, to be frank.
And there's some government initiatives coming through, aren't there?